There we go.
Hello. Am I here
Just
now?
start again from the beginning.
I have my different layers of introduction.
No, just go ahead.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay. So you can imagine Tweezer experiments as well, where you're not doing Rydberg excitations, but maybe you're relying upon actually being able to control the emotional state of the atom, which we're not wonderfully great at right now. But on the other hand, it's interesting to explore bosonic atoms in our system, as well as a number of fermionic atoms. So the talk today will zoom in even a little bit more on these concepts in the context of sort of a quantum optics perspective on the motion control of these atoms in the optical tweezers. How well can we control that degree of freedom? How well can we characterize what we have once we've created these data? So what is the fidelity of the state preparation? What are different ways you can characterize it? For Rydberg gates, for example, the motion of the atom in the optical tweezer is a little bit important. You're sort of second order sensitive to Doppler shifts and these sorts of things. So that's something that will benefit from better motional control. But also it's just sort of fun to play around with what I call the state space of the motion in the harmonic oscillator of the trap. Can we create non-possible states of motion in space, and can we characterize it? So from this perspective, this talk will focus in a little bit on another thing that's sort of important to me in the context of cooling a large variety of things, including solid state objects, for example, their quantum ground state, and looking at their motion. So you can imagine an atom in a trap that rolls back and forth by the mass on a spring. In general, can we place such mechanical motion in non-classical or entangled states? Certainly you can with atoms. People are working on it with larger and larger things. Can we use those motional specific degrees of freedom in the context of, say, computing or construction or sensing? And this will be a little clearer as we go along. Not in these experiments with single atoms, but generally people are looking towards sort of new physical regimes where you might increase mass and push in the direction of quantum physics. For all of these types of things, one challenge is synthesis and replication of quantum states of arbitrary isolated mechanical modes. So there's a long history to all of this. So if you ask about using motion in quantum computing, of course, ions are something that comes to mind. Or if you talk about doing quantum tomography on the motion of a single particle, trapped ions have been doing this for a very long time. Some of you in this audience may have done some of this work right here, where actually if you take a piezoelectric mode and you have a superconducting qubit, you actually have a nice nonlinear resource in your system, and you can, for example, count phonons in your solid state system. You can also optically couple to different types of mechanical vibrations. Some of the work in my group is actually taking solid objects and looking at their motion and doing things like quantum transduction between, say, microwave and optical fields through that vibrating degree of freedom. So just another motivation for being able to control that vibrating degree of freedom. So people are pushing this further and further. I think in atom interferometers, you can push this with many atoms. In the context of solid systems, people try to make bigger and bigger solid things and ask how well they can place them in a quantum state. These two examples right here are, I think, sort of this one in particular, far from quantum in current experiments, but you can imagine a giant mirror or some pretty large volume of superfluid helium and trying to place those in the ground state. Other things that people look at, not in my group, but generally as just an analogy, are levitated nano and microparticles. So you can take a bead inside of a cavity, as shown here. This is optically trapped inside of this cavity, and you can do cavity cooling with that object in its ground state. You can also think about magnetic levitation of a particle. And for all these types of experiments, people are thinking about different ways that you could reach domains where, for example, you could create a non-classical state of that movement. And it would be really nice in those cases if you had some sort of controlled two-level system. So you could couple those. But generally, in these types of systems in particular, that's not something that's sort of always available, that you have that two-level system to couple to. So what are types of experiments that you could do to get this classical motion to begin with? I mean, some sort of nonlinearity. Maybe you could use a little bit in the trap or something like this. And let's say you had this state. How would you characterize it? How would you know what it looks like if all you have is, say, a glass? So that's a problem that I was discussing with Oriol Romero-Isaac, who's in Innsbruck, and he's thought a lot about the years about levitated glass bead particles. And he's thought about, well, if I had a neutral nanoparticle and it's trapped, then I don't have a controllable degree of freedom to utilize to characterize its state. What are different ways that I could look at the state of this particle? And so he was thinking about doing quantum tomography of this particle, but only by letting that particle fly and then taking a picture of it. So of course it has to scatter light, so you can take a picture of it. But otherwise, there's no other thing that you're utilizing. You're just measuring its momentum. So in that context, we were talking about, well, we could use our single atom and an optical tweezer, think about its motion, after we put it in a non-classical state, and then look at this problem from a perspective of time of flight, and can I fully characterize the motion of this particle, and how well does this work in the context of a trap like this, which is actually not unlike the trap being used for these nanoparticle experiments. Okay. And then there's also sort of an interesting large state space here that I'll talk about later in the context of we actually create interesting states. How squeezed the state motionally can we make in this synchroharmonic oscillator? So I'll flash this up just to indicate sort of how old this business of quantum tomography on single particles is. So this is a Physics Today article from BD Life and Company. So this was an article that was written sort of after a couple of experiments were done sort of around 1995, 1996, with helium atoms in a beam being thrown at the slits, as well as trapped ions coupled to an internal degree of freedom of the atom at NS. So in this description, right, it's discussing the possibility of, say, plotting the Wigner quasi-probability distribution in the context of that single particle. Okay, where we have x and p here, and this is a state that gives me some negativity in that function. And it's useful to look at the shadows and mirrors that they're referring to. In particular, the shadows are, I'm taking many cuts, many different iterations of the experiment in order to map out this full quantum state. Okay, so this is generally a useful thing that's been done for a variety of single particles, but not for a trapped particle in exactly the way that I'm going to describe. So the idea that Oriol was thinking about in the context of doing quantum tomography only by using time of flight is really just utilizing the fact that you can turn off the trap. You have a trap. It's a really simple trap in our case. It's just this optical tweezer. To turn off the trap, and then of course you can measure the velocity for any mass that scatters light by just waiting your time of flight time, waiting for that particle to go some distance with free space evolution, nothing on, and then you have direct access to the momentum for this particle of mass. So to get the position, though, in order to make this full map, right, and really know that we can see sort of things going on in phase in that space, is if I want to look at the position of the particle in the optical tweezer, the resolution of my objective is not good enough to do that. So I can't just look at its position. But what I can do is I can let my particle evolve for a time that I'm going to call T evolution in this harmonic oscillator of the optical tweezer. And so if I do that, then I can interplay between x and p. And so then I can choose a time that I measure x or any quadrature in between. And I can do the same thing. I drop the optical tweezer potential, I let the particle fly, and I measure a momentum distribution that actually represents another quadrature. Right? So in this way, I have access to that full space. And you really want to see that you can preserve phase in that space, and you'd really like to utilize that to get the full quantum state. Okay, so Orwell was interested for a trap like an optical tweezer and a single particle. So in sort of somewhat more sophisticated picture here, I have this evolution time that I sit in the trap, and what that evolution time is doing is it's rotating me in this XP space, and I can measure any quadrature I want, depending on how long I wait in the trap. And any given particular iteration of the experiment, I'm still just letting the particle fly out of the tweezer, and then I'm measuring its momentum distribution. If I do this, this is sort of the analogy to optical homodyne tomography. And in that sense, what I'm really sort of doing is sort of being sort of forced and reconstructing the whole density matrix, the populations and the coherences, and then I can plot this Wigner quasi-probability distribution in X and P. And I want to see if we can see non-classicality this way for a single particle in this experiment. Okay, so time of flight is probably something that many of you are familiar with for many different types of experiments. So I just wanted to point out some connections between this work and other things with ensembles and otherwise. So Bose-Einstein condensates, atoms and optical lattices. These are all cases where people take large ensembles of atoms, you let them fly, and the momentum distribution immediately tells you a lot about the system. Of course, in atom interferometers, the atoms are allowed to fly. There have been some experiments where actually people have taken a whole Bose-Einstein condensate in a trap, and then put that whole cloud of atoms into some interesting states, and then use the ability to measure the center of that distribution to map out what the state of that system was in. There are also early experiments in optical lattices where squeezed and other states were looked at in the context of an ensemble measurement where the whole optical lattice was dropped, and one could learn about the individual states of the atoms, but of all the atoms at the same time. There also are a number of experiments these days where people are utilizing the time of flight in the context of single atoms in tweezers. So this is a way that you could, for example, imagine if you had a couple atoms in the trap. Typically, if you try to measure them in the trap, you have lattice-assisted collisions, and you only get parity imaging. So you can let them fly, and in that way they're separated, and then you get a glimpse of them. You can also use it to get momentum and spin resolved information, as in this paper. And there's actually quite early work in Antoine Brouwer's group when they were first loading atoms into optical tweezers to get a sense of the temperature of those atoms by just letting many iterations of the experiment happen, letting them fall, and then they could look at a blob here and determine what the temperature of the atom cloud was. Okay, so any of these experiments, of course, involve we load an atom in the optical tweezer, we do something to it, and then we let it fly, we take a picture, then we do this many times. In our experiments, this is all laser cooling experiments, there's no evaporative cooling, so this is all fairly quick stuff. Okay, so I'm going to orient you a little bit to our optical tweezer apparatus here. So it's a pretty standard type system. It doesn't have sort of multiple potentials for rearranging atoms in. It just has two acousto-optic reflectors that allow us to position the atoms in X and Y. And we form the array of atoms here, and we look back to the same objective. This is rubidium atoms, where we're capping at 850 nanometers, and then we're collecting the fluorescence at 780 nanometers. The sort of distinct feature of this particular apparatus is that we can get the atoms actually quite close to each other compared to some of these Rydberg experiments. So they're close enough that they can actually tunnel between the two wells in these optical tweezers. And I'll talk about that more in a bit. Okay. All right, now feel free to ask questions as we go along, and it seems like I'm also still close enough to the microphone. Okay. So in order to work with a non-classical state of motion, we have to place the atom in a pure state to begin with, so we have to get to the ground state of our optical tweezer. And for this, we do use an internal state of the atom. So we're going to do Raman sideband cooling on the atom in a very
my quantum optics lecture for this
oh, okay.
this one.
All right. The data. So yeah, so this is a textbook Raman cooling, and in fact, very in that. So there's over the years, and in fact, I'm at Stanford here, in Raman cooling and optical lattices was often done with sort of different beams within lattices and cooling as well. In these types of experiments, the tweezer is really holding the atom, just like you would in an ion experiment. And then there's just external cooling beams that come in, and then also an optical beam. And in these experiments, compared to neutral atom experiments where the atoms are sort of packed in tightly, maybe rescattering matters or these sorts of things, there's really just an isolated atom. So this is showing a sideband spectrum for the X and Y, so the radial dimensions of this trap. And we can see that we can cool pretty close to the ground state. We can make this sideband go away to a better noise. So the Raman spectroscopy actually doesn't tell us too much about the residual infidelities here, but there are some. There's also an axial dimension of the trap, which we also cool in these experiments. It's a little harder to cool because its trap frequency is even smaller. So trap frequencies in these experiments where we cool is about 150 kilohertz, which is not ion scale frequencies, but it's enough to get pretty decent. Okay, so let me tell you about sort of a first iteration of these types of experiments where we do time of flight on this atom that's been cooled to its motional ground state. So the time of flight time in these experiments is typically about a half a millisecond, and the imaging time is a 10 microsecond light pulse after that time of flight. So then we take many iterations of this single atom, and then we can get its momentum distribution. And as you can see, we are taking a lot of pictures here to average. It's a lot faster than Raman sideband spectroscopy to get the temperature of your atom than to look at this. But it's nice to see, and it's interesting to ask. Okay, we get a Gaussian blob, but is it the size that we expect, given the ground state with packet size of the optical tweezer? And accounting for imperfections, it basically is within our ability to calibrate. We can watch this the blob expand as a function of this expansion. And indeed, sort of the zero point energy is important for the expansion size, although it's a little bit larger due to some term. Okay, so that was just a simple Gaussian blob that we got from doing this time of flight. So now we wanted to see if we could get something with more structure from some more interesting states. So I'll talk for a bit about creating those states in the context of optical tweezers, and then I'll talk about actually mapping out what the state is. Okay, so what you could do in these types of experiments, because we do have some control with these Raman transitions, is I could do what ion trappers do, right, which is use, say, the blue sideband transition and put myself into some particular state of the potential. So one, our Raman transitions don't work quite as well as an ion, so for that side of things, it's not something that we often do. And then two, we have another knob in the context of these experiments, which is we can actually use the non-harmonic landscape for the non-classical state creation. So when I have these optical tweezers, and I'll tell you in a moment, we actually ramp them down to a very low depth, where they're not sitting in the bottom of the Gaussian potential, but rather there's just a few bound states, and we have a barrier that looks something like this. So in that case, there is a nonlinearity, and we can utilize that in order to create the states that we want. And this we can get into, you can almost talking like transmummy language or something if you like. Okay. So in the experiments, what we do is we start by cooling in traps that are about 1 millikelvin heat. And those are typical depths for loading atoms into these traps. And then we actually drop the depth of the trap by many orders of magnitude. And in first doing these types of experiments, we thought, well, if we drop the depth by that many orders of magnitude and we're not careful about how we do that, it'll just heat up on the way down. But it's pretty good. You can do that pretty erratically, and you can get into this regime where you can have tunneling between two wells of these two optical features. So we can utilize this tunneling. Let me show you a little bit of what it looks like in a typical experiment. So we can make a double well, and we can load atoms into either one of those traps, and maybe two of them sometimes, but we don't. For the experiments that I'll talk about, for most of the talk, we don't use the cases where we load two of them, just the one. And we can look at starting on the left, or starting on the right. Starting on the left is in blue here. We can look at the probability of being on the left well if we sit for a certain time, letting the atom tunnel back and forth between these two wells. And we can see that we have fairly high contrast oscillations, not perfect, and this is what we utilize in order to create the state we want. Let me go into that a little bit more. So when we do this sort of characterization of the non-classical state of the atom, there will be some infidelity in our state creation of how well we're able to place the state in that motional state, our atom in that motional state. So the Raman spectroscopy is actually a somewhat noisy measurement to tell what the infidelities of that state creation are. So I want to mention briefly one way that we can sort of compare the purity of our state creation to what we see ultimately when we do the tomography. And that's actually sort of looking at a Hahn-Mandel effect with two atoms in these in the optical tweezers. So these are bosonic atoms. So when they interfere, sort of like a photon would interfere on a beam splitter, you can get the following effect. So in the photon case, which I'll just show here, this is a touchstone. If I have two photons that are created and they impinge simultaneously on this beam splitter, what I'll end up with is a 2, 0 plus 0, 2 state. And I can look at the number of coincidence counts, which would be like the 1, 1 state that I would get out. I have fermions, of course I get that all the time. With bosons, I should not get it at all. And this dip should go to 0. And it should depend on the position of this beam splitter because the photons have to impinge at exactly the same time. So there's sort of an analogous idea in the context of our atoms. And that is if we start with two atoms, and they're bosonic, and we really create them in the same state, as pure states, the atoms stay cool very well, then what we would expect is our coincidence counts to go to 0 at this sort of balanced beam splitter point where we have equal tunneling in between these in this double one. And we can see that we go down below 0.5, but not all the way to 0. This is actually somewhat a measure of our purity, of our state creation, and this is something that we can then use as a benchmark against some of the things that we'll see in the images later. Okay, but as we go along here, I'm going to get rid of experiments with two atoms and only just take the ones with one. Okay, so now when we want to create some interesting Fock state to look at in the experiments, what we do is we utilize this tunneling, but we actually, in order to be most robust, what we do is we actually do sort of an adiabatic passage across the tunneling resonance in order to transfer the atom from one well to the other. So we start with an atom over here. We can just leave it in its ground state, and we'll get the blob that we saw before. Or we can bias the two optical tweezers, which we can do by just setting them to different intensities. And we can do this adiabatic passage across the tunneling resonance, and in this case go to the n equals 1 state, or we can go up and go to the n equals 2 state. So that's how we initialize our motional state of the atom. And then we can just measure the momentum distribution for these different cases, and we can see that we get the expected fringing as we go up in Fock state for the atom. And again, these are the same thing as I showed you before, where we're taking 60,000 iterations of the same atom experiment, and then I see these patterns. Yeah, question.
How much worse is it if you just like use multiple sideband pulses to make this Fock state? So
in our experiments, like how good would it be? Let's see. So our blue sideband transition, if we do spectroscopy, and we say we're going to attempt to do a blue sideband, and we're going to see what it looks like. It's sort of like 70% efficient. So This isn't perfect either, but it's slightly better than we can do with our sidebands. Yeah.
How good is it?
This is, yeah, so, okay, that's a, so there's a combination of things here. The ground state preparation to begin with is about 90% 3D. And then the transition over here is like 80–90%. And then there's some blurring in these images that's sort of an imaging factor.
So do you dump the other well at the end?
Yes. So if for some reason we didn't transfer, right? So there is also somewhat of a purification process that can sort of go on in the context of this transfer. So yeah, we do dump. And that's also, yeah, we dump the well, and also if I have no atom, it doesn't contribute to this, right? Like photons are, they disappear in this vacuum. But did that answer the question about the sidebands? Because I mean, in principle, it should work, right? Yeah.
How long does one incremental cycle take?
Yeah, so it's a couple 100 milliseconds.
So you've been averaging since about 2010.
No, but it was like a month.
Yeah, just in this aforementioned question. So, how closely spaced are the two foci?
Yeah, so it's about 800 nanometers.
And what's the atom you're using?
Rubidium. So it's we would like them to be closer. So it's a little dicey in terms of you really like the lattice, which is 11×2, right? And this is a little bit more like that. So the barrier is actually very low, and the trap colors are really funny. Okay, all right. So. Okay, and just to be clear about some of the spatial things that are going on here, because we'll be looking at more complicated pictures later. So we're always integrating over this axial dimension, and we're always tunneling in the x direction, although we could orient the tweezers and tunnel in the y direction instead. Okay, so now getting to sort of the thing that Oriel wanted to know, which is, can you use this time dynamics to get the full space-based picture? So just as an illustration, what you can imagine seeing is, let's say you just displace the trap some, and then you let the wave packet slosh back and forth. And you look as a function of time, and as a function of time, what you're doing is you're rotating within this x and t space. So, okay. And what we do, just in the context of this ground state system, just to give you an example, is we do some filtering of the image in order to take care of sort of high frequency components, and then we integrate in the direction where the interesting physics is not, right? So we integrate in the y direction because we're tunneling in the x direction, and then we get something as a function of x, and then we can actually look at this object as a function of this evolution time. And so if we displace it, well, it's going to slosh back and forth in the trap, and so it's sloshing back and forth in the trap here. And so you can see that we can, in that way, we're really sort of rotating between x and y. Okay, so now we come to somewhat more interesting data where we're looking at the time evolution. So now we start with an n=1 state. But we also do a little something else to the trap in order to see if we can see some nuanced behavior. We also jump the trap a little bit. So there's a tiny bit of sweeping in the system. And so what we can see is mainly this sort of feature of the n=1 state where we have this sort of null in the center. It's a little clearer if you plot it in slightly different ways, but there's a null in the center, and then it's breathing back and forth a little bit, given this tiny bit of squeezing that we added on top of it as well. A tiny bit of dynamics. Okay, so you can take this information, so this time evolution and all these numeric distributions, and you can do maximum likelihood estimation, which is basically what people do when they do optical homodynamic tomography. In the end, our camera noise is sort of the limiting effect in how well we can determine the state. And we can reconstruct the full density matrix This is in the form of a plot, a Hinton plot with the colors in phase. And then we can, from this, we can plot the Wigner probability distribution of an X and P, and we can see that it has a part that goes down in the center there. And there are various artifacts to this that we can spend quite a bit of time discussing, but this is a reconstruction of this.
Can you go into more detail on that, the plot in the lower center?
Yeah, so I mean the main thing you see is that there's a big square here, so that's our N=1 component. So if I didn't squeeze it a little bit, and I just had the box state N=1, I would just have all my population here. But I have some different things going on. I have some off-diagonal stuff from this little bit of squeezing, but also just imperfections in my state creation and in my imaging protocol. And I have some other plots for some other states. For example, if I had a coherent state, this would look differently. If I have interesting phase going on, then I would see the off phase. So with that, yeah, I don't know, actually maybe I can put the Hinton plot here. I guess we'll see. So the next thing we can do, where the Hinton plot will be a little bit more interesting, is I can take this N=1 state and I can displace N=1. So I have some non-classicality as well as some time dynamics. And this is maybe the simplest way that I can do that. Here I'm also jumping the trap a little bit, so I'm also squeezing it a bit. And in this case, then what I did is something that is shifted in this X space, and I can still see that it's negative at the center there. Okay, so it's sort of their phase preservation and a negative value for this case. It would be more interesting if I, say, made a superposition state in this notional state space, which we think we could do via the tunneling, but it's more complicated. Okay. So where are we going with this? So as I just said, you could also imagine doing this full reconstruction for some sort of superposition state or other types of delocalized states. And we can also think about going back to this analogy to the dielectric microparticle or nanoparticle and asking, okay, now that we know we could do this with an atom and a tweezer, could it extend to those experiments? And also from a perspective of not just the characterization, but the state creation. So the way that we did our state creation was we made this nonlinear potential landscape by making this double well. And so you could also imagine even in the larger mass particle case, you could get weak nonlinearity by having a Gaussian potential. And if you utilize that in the right way, that's maybe a way that you could create an interesting state. And so we're actually interested in protocols where maybe you have a Gaussian potential with an atom to begin with, where you could have a decent amount of nonlinearity. And if you modulate that in the right way, can you actually create some interesting state? And then you can characterize it with some time of flight. Also, in these nanoparticle experiments, people want to do sort of faster wave packet expansion, sort of turn a trap on its head and see what you could do with time of flight. It's also something that we could potentially test with atoms. So with that, that's sort of the end of the time of flight part of the talk. I'm happy to answer more questions, but then I'll sort of jump into our other apparatus. Yeah.
So how much does the fact that you have a weaker confinement along the line of sight, how much does that sort of complicate the analysis and stuff? Because then, like, if you look at slices along that, then your two-dimensional harmonic trap is going to look different, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So if that were really long and your microscope objective, right, has a certain field of view, but it also has a certain depth of focus, right? So if it's blurry, as the atom is out here, then it would essentially blur your 2D image. So that's definitely a concern. So we did actually, before we did these experiments at all, that was one of the things the grad student was calculating was, will this be too blurry to see anything because of that axial extent? It turns out that the axial confinement is just, it's enough so that you don't actually get much blurring from that. So most of the blurring is just because our objective isn't aligned perfectly. Was that sort of the question, or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was also, I mean, kind of the distribution itself is gonna change, so you'd have like, I was thinking about as you move forward, as you move along the line of sight, your confinement in the transverse directions is weaker, right? So that's gonna change your spacing, and all of this is sort of with the intuition of having just a linear spacing there.
Yeah, right. So I think another way to say, yeah, okay. So let me discuss another problem in these systems. Not a problem, but something that I simplified. So it's a three-dimensional trap, right? And I'm plotting all these things as a one-dimensional oscillator. So you could also worry that there's couplings between these different dimensions. And so Anna Maria or his group has actually done a full model of the full dimensional tweezer with the Gaussian confinement in all the dimensions, and asked what all the states are, and whether I might have coupling between the different dimensions or the axial dimension because the spacing is very small. How many of those levels do I end up with? How much would our tweezer have to be a little bit out of round for us not to have degeneracies? In the end, what I can say is empirically and in the numerical calculations, it ends up being pretty okay to just approximate it as a 1D.
Yeah, another technical question. So, do you have issues with jitter in the position of vibration of the lattice sites? And is there any parametric behavior in amplitude noise on the beam?
Yeah, exactly. So there's multiple ways that noise can come into this experiment. So one is if I just have a single trap and I cool it out into the ground state, how long can it sit there?
That's good, yeah.
And that's actually really good in these experiments but really good in the context of the atom only lives for 3 seconds in this experiment anyways, because of background lifetime, and I guess that's part of the next discussion. So for those 3 seconds, it stays really quite close to the ground state. But I think the jittering sort of thing that we worry about the most, that's been the most nuanced, and I can't fully answer everything about it, is that if I have the position of the two tweezers, and if there's any relative positional jitter or intensity fluctuation between the two traps, that I think will impact the fidelity of the tunneling, and that ends up being something that we do have fidelity. Right, so the tunneling, I think, is impacted probably by intensity bias fluctuations between the two features.
So I guess in principle, if you have like a harmonic oscillator and suitable, like coupled to like a qubit, then if you have a suitable nonlinearity, you can construct an arbitrary superposition and control the like phases between the individual block states. Does this nonlinearity give you that, or without having to couple additionally to the spin?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, I mean, this one that I'm sort of talking about here that's very small. You can ask the nanoparticle colleagues how small that is and how possible it is. But I mean, I think there's also just the sort of this nonlinearity in the atom trap and how large is that. So yeah, if you have a strong nonlinearity, you're an ion trapper, you're the Raman, you're good at that, and you can also do better tomography that way too, right? I mean, microparity and all of these things. For the atom experiments, we've just started looking into this question of what kind of states could you create. So certainly you can, even in harmonic trap, right? So that might be something to look at. In the context of this, the magic number that we estimate is about a 5% difference between this frequency and this frequency. That's how I think about the anharmonicity. And so then it's a question of how well do you control, so what is the line width of your ability to control the system compared to that 5% nonlinearity. And so that's something that we're sort of exploring in the context of, for these particular cases, how coherent can the things be? Does that answer the
Mostly, yeah.
yeah.
So we
We
want
should
to
keep
hear,
going?
we want an update on the other piece. So
Okay.
let's go till about 5 hours.
All right. All right, so I'm going to tell you about our.
Okay, we're out of time.
It says right
I'm
here,
sorry.
I've been going for 51 minutes. But yeah, as John said, this will be an update on another apparatus, and I know there are a lot of cryogenic atom experiments around here as well, so I want to make sure to give you a sense of what we're doing. So this is also a Rubidium 87 optical tweezer apparatus. It has quite a different focus. It's instead of a single atom, it's for many atoms, and it's for a more Rydberg excitation type experiment. And the idea of this apparatus that I'm making is combining tweezer arrays in a cryogenic system with all sorts of optical access to sort of be able to do implement recent progress in high fidelity Rydberg experiments, but in this cryogenic environment. So cryogenic systems have played a long-standing role in design experiments, and then also Rydberg cavity experiments with nuclear states, etc. This particular apparatus is coming a little more from the angle of showing we can leverage something that seems sort of simple, but is pretty nice, better vacuum via cryopumping, as well as a colder black body environment for Rydberg atoms. We're planning to use the 70S states, rubidium, where we only get a little more than a factor of 2 improvement in the lifetime from that cold box, but nonetheless, we want to see if we can get those type of enhancements. This will be also a hybrid shallow angle lattice and tweezers for many qubit physics. We'll have lattice beams coming from the side here, make a large array, and then we have optical tweezer lenses outside of here. And our system is really predicated on a couple aspects. One is we wanted to make this very much like a typical cold atom apparatus. We can put lots of beams in, and it's low vibration, importantly. And your optics, your important tweezer lenses, for example, could be warm. You really only have a select part of it cold. And as I said, we wanted it low vibration to maintain the sort of usual things that we can do in these types of experiments. Over the years, we've worked with these optomechanical systems, actually at 100 millikelvin temperatures, and we know how horrible it can be if you ever do something that's pretty vibration. Okay. So just as a little bit more context, to leverage better vacuum, basically we'll have a cold box inside of the system and a cryopumping cold finger that goes into this. This is very schematic. In terms of vacuum lifetime and why that's important, if you want 1,000 out of the array and you want 99% of the array to survive within 100 milliseconds, you need a really long single atom lifetime. There's a group, there's an experiment in Antoine Traoré's group that is doing a pretty similar thing, although not with warm lenses. And there they get 6,000 seconds right now. And then this cold box itself, we'll have cold windows as well. It'll be about 30 Kelvin. So going forward on this the technical part of the talk, I'll show you what this whole system looks like and what the design principles are. So we have a 2D mod up here, and then we send the atoms into a 3D mod that exists down here, and then the lenses are inside of this chamber. This is a cross section of the system. So we have our tweezer lenses here, and then we have a cold box that comes around like this in this funny shape, with cold windows as well, and then we have this cryopumping cold finger that comes along here, radiation shielded by that bar. And the cryostat connection is here and here. And we're isolated via copper braids between the cold box and the radiation shield here. And I'll show you in a minute sort of what the cryostat technology looks like. And here are the beams from the shallow angle lattice in the effect. So the concept in terms of cooling the system is really to use a system where there's a GM cryocooler, but it's not on the table. So it sits underneath the table in this box. And this particular system has a secondary loop of helium gas that's cooled down here, and then it comes up through this tube, comes into here, and cools the cryostat that sends our little cold chip into here. Okay, so it's only helium gas that comes and flows up here. It's like your old-fashioned flow cryostat, but we don't have to fill it. The helium doer all the time, right? So this is a technology that we're trying out. That to us makes it seem like this part can stay pretty much the same, just like we're always been used to, and then we have the flow track technology. This is what our whole box looks like. So this is designed specifically for these rubidium 87 experiments where we're doing 70s Rydberg states. We don't care super about the microwave environment, but we want the box to be cold. If we want to do this proof of principle, we can control the black body temperature. We have electrodes, and then we have cold windows here that allow us to have quite a bit of optical access. Some of them are actually double pane, which is a concept where you can, the outer one can be somewhat hotter, and then the inner one can be colder. So this is the picture of some atoms in this system. So we have atoms in the 2D MOT that's up here. And then we can sort of aim that through a bunch of pinholes into our chamber here. And we now have a rubidium 87 MOT in this main chamber here. And then we can trap atoms in optical tweezers in this apparatus here. Here are some pictures of single atoms randomly loaded into the tweezers. Right now, there's a bit of a glitch in the system where all of this seems to be working really, really well. Except for the cold finger isn't quite as cold as we want it to be. So it's not cryopumping, or we would expect it not to be cryopumping really well. Nonetheless, these atoms live for 90 seconds, even without baking the chamber. So we're pretty happy with that, but we gotta fix the cold finger. The other aspect of the system, if you want to use it for precision optical tweezer experiments, I already mentioned the vibrations, but also if you're going to have your objectives outside of your cold box, you want to maintain good alignment between the tweezer and the cold windows. And so you can ask how well can we do that when this part is cooling down and this part is not. So we can look at reflections off the cold windows in the tweezer lens. These are where they start like this at room temperature, and then we can find less than 0.1 milliradian change as you cool down between the cold box and the tweezer.
How much is that change in terms of displacement in the
So it's the thing that we mainly worry about from that is that you'll get aberrations in the tweezer focus because the window is crooked with respect to the focus beam. And so 0.1 milliradians is good for the objectives we use. And we can also do interferometry of the cold box with respect to the table. This plot is a little hard to parse a bit. So scale 5 nanometer RMS. And what you can see is, ignore the fact that it's sort of drifting up and down at low frequency. That's just our Michelson drifting. But what you can see is with the cryocooler on, there's this little bit of spikes you can see. And if you actually put a little bit of lead on this transfer tube that comes in, that brings in the helium gas, you can really squash that. So it's basically the same as the cryocooler off. So we're really quite happy with this as a low vibration system. Okay, so sort of going, wrapping up with a little bit of the backwards introduction to this idea of a cryogenic experiment. So there's many different systems that I think might go in these type of directions, of course, for a long time. Circular states have been studied in this context. There have been clocks made in these cold environments. But I think increasingly for alkaline computing platforms, long lifetime for scalability, like we're looking at here. For tweezer and lattice clocks, lifetime to reduce black body shifts, molecules using some lattices. There's a lot of reasons why these technologies might come together in the future. So here's all the people who did all the work here, and thank you very much for your attention.
So we've had a pretty lively interaction during the talk, but we have a little bit of time if people have a couple more questions. So our normal rule is that we start with student questions, but I guess we've had a fair number of those. Okay, you have one, Tony? Go.
Sort of. This is actually like inspired by what we were earlier. I saw you have like these big kind of coils outside your cryo apparatus. What kind of switching times do you get?
Yeah, so those are just the shim coils, and they're pretty slow. The MOT coils are actually recessed,
Oh,
Yeah, so
Oh,
they're,
are they in the?
yeah. So you can't see it in this picture, because you don't have the top lid on, but basically there's a vacuum lid top here, and there's a recessed window with the coils inside of there.
Okay, so they're just inside the steel, but not like
Not
right
in,
against.
no, not inside the cold box, yeah. Yeah, no cold coils here.
I was wondering, I guess, if you have an atom in your superposition of two traps, if you sort of slowly transfer the atom from one trap to the other, you would observe like heating on the trap, or like if you could see like some limit set by like Landauer's principle there in like your quantum state, or is that would that be dissipated somewhere else, or like it's technically not possible?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I tend to think of these systems as I'm always trying to make sure there's no dissipation. So in that context, if I create a superposition between the two wells, and then let's say I moved it over up, and then I transferred it to another state. I mean, in principle, I maintain some superposition or something. That's how I usually operate. Okay, but now you want to ask about I have some source of dissipation, and I want to look at thermodynamic type things, or what would I see?
I guess, yeah, like there's some idea where like if I erase a bit of information that necessarily
Yeah,
dissipates some heat,
Yeah.
but I was wondering if like, because you have such good cooling initially, like
Then I
what
could
limits you would see.
that heat in
Yeah.
this case. Okay, I'll think about that one. I don't know the answer.
Mark, you were next.
So, yeah, thanks, great talk, thank you. It's, Frank Peterman a while ago did a, single line interferometry experiment.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, can you get, kind of interfunction type of information with an interferometry protocol? Like, he basically did an asymmetric sequence, so he did a momentum shear. Does that give you the same information, or?
Yeah, so my guess is it can give you the same type of information. You have to just go after all the bits of information, right? And yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, that is on the list back there, because I think it's, yeah, I mean, you can also ask, so I mean, that was sort of like a free space experiment, right? And then they catch it again. I mean, you can also ask, can you take two tweezers and couple them? And come back together again. But yeah, can you do Wigner's tomography based upon their sort of release and catch again experiment? I would think if you wait the right amount of time and observe the right amount of right thing, that you could. I think that was with more thermal atoms as well.
All right, Leo, last question. Oh, all right. You have a question. Okay, so in that case, if you have more questions for Cindy, please stick around, and thank you again for watching. Some protocol for making a cat state